Welcome back. This is the lecture on the relationship between art and society as a whole. Last time we looked at art and how it directly affects individual people's lives, or how it relates to our experiences of daily life, big moments in our own personal lives, birth, death, and all points in between. But today we want to look at the relationship between art and how it's affected by, how it relates to, interwoven with some of the larger aspects of our shared lives. So when we think about people coming together in groups, two of the major aspects of human relationships in social settings include our religious beliefs and practices and our political lives, like how our society functions outside of just our personal relationships, but now as our relationships to one another. So these themes have existed in visual art, just like the themes of birth and death have existed from the beginning of people's making of art 30,000 years ago, roughly speaking. We'll look at specifically religion and its connection to politics. We'll look specifically at politically themed art, both the art of people who are supporting the power base that exists and people who are kind of rebelling against that power base. Then we'll turn our attention to controversial art forms, to pieces that have caused controversy throughout American history in particular. Definitely, we've already looked at Hammurabi's code. We talked about the stele of Hammurabi and the connection between writing, image making, language, religion, and law. I just wanted to draw back to this piece for a second to kind of remind us that these connections between visual images and establishment of power and establishment of religious power as a connection to political control of a society has been with us for centuries. We talked a little bit about the types of Hammurabi's code, the laws that are encoded there on the stele. You don't by any means need to memorize all of these or even read them all. I just wanted to show you how many of them exist, why we refer to them by the catchphrase an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, because the way most of them are worded is it tells you what the crime is. If a man put out the eye of another man, for instance, it tells you what the consequence of that act would be. His eye shall be put out. So eye for an eye. Definitely, it's intriguing to think about religion and its relationship to power when we look at ancient societies. When we look at the work of ancient Egypt, the sculpture to the left at first glance may read to us today as a female body. There seems to be a kind of narrowing in the torso and then a widening in the spread of the hips. So it kind of has a classic hourglass shape, but in fact you're not looking at a female body, you're looking at the depiction of the pharaoh, of the king. It's a man. He definitely has a little bit of a pooch in the belly. You can kind of see that in this image here to the side, right? You can see him when he sits in profile. So perhaps there's a little more human approach to the way the figure is depicted. He's not as depicted as perfectly muscular. You can kind of see the sag in the stomach. You can certainly get a feeling that this is a little bit more personal and maybe even a more real depiction of what this person's body actually looked like, as opposed to those kind of perfect cookie cutter bodies that we saw when we were talking about the conventions of representation, how the Egyptians presented themselves in a very systematic and rigorously similar way. The reason I think this is kind of fascinating is that this image of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV is really kind of a remarkable change in society and in art making during the reign of Amenhotep and his immediate successors. Amenhotep decides that he is no longer going to follow the priests who are promoting the supremacy of the god Amun. He turns his attention to the sun god Aten, A-T-E-N, and in fact he changes his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is now announcing by this change of his name formally that he is a follower of the god Aten. And Aten at the time in ancient Egypt was one of the few cults that would have promoted the idea of there being a single deity, as opposed to a pantheon of gods. The Egyptians had gods for every conceivable aspect of their lives, and so this cult of Aten was really kind of remarkable, because for the first time, here's a culture that is promoting this idea of there being a single supreme being. And as soon as that is the belief system, notice that the art begins to soften. We get a more personalized depiction of the people in the work. Look at the way his children behave. There's looseness in the way the bodies are depicted. You can see them touching his face here. You can see the babies pointing and talking, stroking mom's face here as well. Even though we still have the face immobile, the shoulders in full face, and the legs turned in profile again, it's still that composite view. There's much more movement and naturalism in the image of Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti. Certainly when we look at the images of Nefertiti herself, you see this really beautiful human-looking woman, as opposed to the kind of images that we saw in earlier Egyptian sculptures. So this very brief reign of Akhenaten and his heir, his nephew Tutankhamun, King Tut, it's a very brief period during which the cult of Aten becomes kind of the primary religious practice of the royal family. Very briefly, the artwork relaxes a bit, and we start getting images that are more personal. This one-on-one relationship with God leads us to a more human-looking artwork. It's kind of fascinating. This is the depiction of Akhenaten's brother and his bride, and the thing I love about this image, you can see it here. This is the original. This is sort of a reproduction that makes it a little clearer to see, but you can see that he's actually not completely in profile. He's actually in three-quarter view. He's walking toward us, and as he moves, his clothing is actually responding to that movement. We haven't seen anything like that in Egyptian art prior to this movement. Now, ironically, this period during which the cult of Aten becomes kind of the religion of the royal family is known as the Amarna Revolution. It's the only time in ancient Egyptian history during which the art loosens and changes like this. As soon as the reign of Tut is over, things swing back to the traditional way of making Egyptian art. A very brief window during which art changes as a response to religion. We certainly can look at in Christian imagery, especially in the Middle Ages, we can look at how art changed from the high degree of verism and naturalism that we saw in the art of ancient Rome, particularly at the height of the Roman Empire. Art really began to look almost photographically real. And then as the culture moves a pantheistic religion to accepting Christianity as the dominant religion, which happens around the year 300 under the Emperor Constantine. Once that becomes safe to practice and legal to practice in the empire, and eventually becomes the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, we start to see artwork changing, and this emphasis on verism or reality, naturalism in art becomes much important, and the emphasis shifts towards easily recognizable symbols that would communicate the idea of the faith. So in this image, you're seeing a carving from the tympanum, the rounded space above the doorway, the main entrance to a cathedral, in the Romanesque style. And you're seeing Christ actually seated on a throne, although he looks kind of like he's standing up or kind of making a ballet move like a plie. He seems almost to be springing forward, but he's meant to be seated. You see that it's not a quote-unquote realistic depiction of him seated with good foreshortening on the thighs. What's more important is for us to recognize who he is and what he's doing. He's sitting in judgment. The figures on the left represent angels taking the saved souls up to heaven, and on the right you can see an angel and a demon weigh souls, and the damned are being forced headfirst into a furnace down into hell. You can see that a little more clearly here. You can really see that red arrow pointing at the boots of a figure that's being forced headfirst into the flames. That doesn't really feel like the Christianity that we're used to in the 21st century, that kind of personal relationship with God that you're accustomed to hearing about. This feels much more like a vengeful God who's back in judgment, right? Who's returned to judge the souls and to cast those who are wanting into the fires of hell. That seems much harsher than the religion that you may be accustomed to in your personal lives. We have to remember that the people of the Middle Ages really were, for the most part, illiterate. They didn't read, they couldn't read. Very few people, mainly the nuns and priests in the monasteries and nunneries, a handful of people in the royal court, but for the most part, people were illiterate, and people needed to have symbols that they could easily recognize and understand in order to communicate the ideas of what the religion was about, because of course they couldn't read the text themselves. Definitely when we think about political art, we need to think a little bit about the issue of propaganda. Art can speak for people who have power, and that's clearly what you're seeing here. This is an image of the Emperor Octavian. He, in fact, changes his name to Augustus. He becomes the first true emperor after Caesar is assassinated. His nephew rises in power. He eventually defeats Antony and Cleopatra and absorbs Egypt into the Roman Empire and initiates the era known as the Pax Romana, or the era of the Augustan peace, a period of stability under his reign. So if you look at the sculpture, he is in the pose of an orator. The gesture of his hand going forward like that is meant to look like someone who is giving a speech. He is dressed in armor, so clearly he is a successful warrior soldier. He's got the robe around him the way a senator would, so he's a politician. His face is absolutely recognizable. It's that Roman naturalism or verism, that reliance and dependence upon the truth. But the body is very much idealized. It's very much that Greek perfect muscular form and the perfect proportion of 10 heads tall. That proportional relationship is very much there. You might also notice a religious symbol. You see the figure at the bottom by his foot that is a winged figure we associate with Cupid. Well, Cupid, of course, is the son of Venus and her lover, Mars, the god of war. So those two extremes have come together in this figure of Cupid, and you can clearly see that he, Emperor, is more important than Cupid. He's showing you that he is descended or connected to the gods, but that in some ways he is superior to them as well. The reason that I think of this piece as a great piece of propaganda is not only that it makes him look like a heroic warrior leader, but also because the piece was not intended to be shown in the capital of Rome. This actually is known as the Augustus of Prima Porta, because the sculpture was located in a resort city outside of Rome. So the dissemination of the emperor's image was vital to showing his power throughout the empire. He needed to be recognizable and visible even in places where he wasn't physically present. This is a great example of art that then supports people who are outside of the power base. This is a Romantic era painting, and yes, there are dead bodies. Yes, there's an evidence of cannibalism here, so it's hard for us to imagine that this style should be called Romantic, but in fact it is. Romantic style of the late 1790s into the early 1800s, the Romantic style is really about people pushed to very, very extreme extremes of emotion, extremes of moral decisions that have to be made. And in fact, it's kind of similar to the storyline of the first several seasons of the television program The Walking Dead. Those are characters who we were interested in on an emotional level, not just because of the gore of a zombie apocalypse, but because these people had to make moral choices under very extreme circumstances. That's kind of at the heart of the Romantic style of the early 1800s. And Géricault, French painter, was very known for this style, for showing, depicting people in extreme situations. And this painting is actually depicting a real event. The Medusa was a French ship with passengers on it. Its captain was not particularly gifted at being a sea captain, and he ran the ship aground. They were on their way from France to a French colony on the coast of Africa. He ran the ship aground, and it started to sink, and they did make an attempt to get everyone off the boat, but the majority of the life boats, the majority of the escape vessels that were available were used by the crew, and a lot of the passengers, people who were on their way to colonize this French colony in Africa, were left to their own devices. They actually made this raft themselves out of bits of the original ship, the Medusa. They were towed for a brief period of time by the official lifeboats, but they were quickly left to their own devices. They were not expected to survive. The captain, of course, made it back home, reported this big tragedy, and then a few days later, in fact, for about 12 or 13 days, these people drifted on the ocean before they were picked up by another ship. The few people who were rescued, 15 people survived of the 150 passengers who initially were aboard the raft. The 15 people who survived told their story when they got back home, and it became a national scandal. And of course, it's very much about the people who were being kind of abused by the people in power. The painting is a brilliant composition that shows rising action, people who are dead and dying, rising up to the figures that still have the vitality and energy enough to signal to those ships that you can see on the horizon that are coming to say that pretty remarkable story. In point of fact, the artist who made the painting, Géricault, had the raft reassembled in his studio so he could make the painting as accurate as possible. And he made multiple studies before deciding on this final composition. Of course, he didn't directly witness the event. He's recreating it a bit from his imagination. Another artist of the Romantic style is the Spanish painter Goya, and Goya depicts here an uprising of Spanish citizens against the invading French army under the leader Napoleon. When Napoleon's forces took control of Spain, they actually occupied the country for several years, nearly a decade, before they were finally defeated. The people here are being obviously are attacking French soldiers. They're rising up and defending their homeland. However, these citizens of Madrid are not going to survive. They rebel against the French on May the 2nd. The 3rd of May is the famous painting. This is the more famous of the pair. This shows the French soldiers rounding the rebels up and putting them to death in an execution in a firing squad. So it's a really kind of dramatic storytelling, but you notice that we in this painting can only see the faces of the Spanish citizens of Madrid. We can't see the faces of the French soldiers. So are we manipulated a bit, both by Géricault's painting of the raft of the Medusa and by Goya's painting of the 3rd of May? It's very clear who we are supposed to be supporting, who we're supposed to be sympathetic toward from the point of view of the artist who made these works. So remember that art is intentional, art is controlled, art is something that is arrived at by an artist's planning, thinking of a composition, thinking of a theme. Obviously, we're being somewhat guided by the person who made each of these works, how we're meant to feel, how we're meant to respond. That is equally true with this 20th century piece by Pablo Picasso. Picasso had been asked to create a painting for the Spanish pavilion of a World's Fair. although he was living and working in Paris, of course, Picasso was born in Spain. He was the most famous Spanish artist of the 20th century, without question. His original composition for this painting was a very egotistical image of an artist, obviously him, kind of loosely veiled, painting a series of nude female models in the studio. It was very much about his own kind of power as an artist. But as he was working on it, news broke of this horrific war crime that had taken place. Spain was actually in the midst of a civil war at the same time that a variety of fascist dictatorships are beginning to form throughout Europe. In particular, of course, the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party is very much happening at the same time as the Spanish Civil War. So one side of the Civil War was being led by General Franco in Spain, and Franco allied himself with Hitler and with his Axis powers in order to gain the upper hand in the Civil War. The payoff, or the trade-off for that, was that the Nazi Party wanted to practice their war strategy, if you will, of bombing civilian sites to see if they could effectively use this as a strategy. And so essentially what happens is the city of Guernica is offered by General Franco and his troops as a test run for the Blitzkrieg approach. The planes fly over, they bomb the city for a matter of hours. The city burns for a number of days. It's about 3 hours worth of an attack and 3 days worth of burning the city to the ground. Many of the people were not at home when it happened, but the people who were essentially wiped out. And so what you're seeing is a very abstracted depiction of decapitated heads, severed limbs, animals, and people fleeing, people carrying dead bodies of loved ones, people trapped in buildings that are on fire. If you were to see an actual photograph of really happening, I'm sure that it would be too much, too intense, too horrific for most of us to be able to look at for very long. So Picasso's choice to paint this in a synthetic cubist style, to have this level of abstraction to kind of separate us a bit from the direct realism of the event, allows us to look at it for longer and to process it on an emotional level. A piece that's rarely shown, but is the companion of Guernica, is the piece at the bottom of the screen, which he made after it was revealed what was happening in the death camps, in the concentration camps. And so that is a very heavily abstracted image of a pile of mutilated bodies. So Picasso's work was very much politicized, especially during and around the Second World War. An artist who definitely makes his work, whether it be performance, photographs, or even constructed installation sculptural objects, and is still active today, is the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. He's a really fascinating character for us to look at, an artist who has destroyed cultural artifacts as a form of bringing about our attention to the fact that some of the art forms of ancient China were actually highly elitist and were in fact supplanting native traditions. So he's photographed himself destroying kind of classic works as an act of political protest. In fact, he was even jailed for 81 days in 2011. No formal charges really ever being brought. They claimed that there had been some impropriety on his part, but it was never clearly stated why he was being imprisoned. His studio was under surveillance for years as well. He's definitely an artist who has criticized the contemporary Chinese government in his works. And you can see that pretty clearly in this piece as well. He's done a number of photographs, self-portrait photographs with this kind of gesture. He definitely is known, though, for work that takes on real social issues. The image that you see here is a sculpture that at first may not look all that impressive. It's a mass of metal that's all in straight lines. What you're actually seeing, though, is an installation of 150 tons of steel rebar that was collected from collapsed schools that collapsed in a horrific earthquake that took place in 2008 in Sichuan in China. His team collected these objects, the twisted rebar from the destroyed schools, and they, as a group, re-straightened them back into usable form, and then created the sculpture to kind of heal the damage that had happened, but also to call our attention to it. That's also what's happening with Remembering from 2009, which is constructed entirely out of children's backpacks of different colors, but it spells the sentence, "She lived happily for 7 years in this world," which was a quote from one of the mothers of one of the children who died in the earthquake. So he's definitely using his art, a form of social protest against an oppressive government. You can see in these works that are all based on his direct experience of his incarceration. These are presented at a very small scale. You can see people peering into these sealed black boxes. These are some of the scenes that you can see within that form. Definitely, there are plenty of artworks that are about the disparity, especially in America, between the races. These are political statements made by the artist Robert Colescott, who's an African-American painter. It's a really clever painting, I think, that takes a classic image you're used to seeing, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and recasts the characters from that image as kind of stereotypical African Americans, very much pushing of those kind of horrific stereotypes that have been used. The kind of mammy character that you see here. There's the mouse is circling her right now. The kind of chef character you might associate with Uncle Ben's rice. These are obviously meant to be very much drawing our attention to stereotypical racist ways that African Americans have been presented in media. The painting is called Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, clearly drawing our attention to the issues between the races. And you can see this here as well in a more contemporary example. Kenneth Wiley's painting from 2005 is of an African-American man in kind of contemporary urban clothing. He's got kind of camo pants. He's got the stylish boots that you see as well, right? Head wrap. He's dressed in kind of contemporary urban fashion, but he's directly in the pose and in the painting that's been sort of reproduced that originally was made of Napoleon crossing the Alps. This was painted by the court painter Jacques-Louis David, who initially worked in the neoclassical style and became very much part of the court painting that supported Napoleon. So here we have this kind of combination of an established power and somebody from outside the power base kind of combined together in this ironic postmodern way. It's a pretty brilliant piece. This is a great example of conceptual art. Fred Wilson, another African-American artist, doesn't actually make anything. He instead makes thoughts happen. He uses his art to provoke your thought process and to make you think. He goes into, with the permission of the owners of these collections, he goes into museums and rearranges objects to make them have a different context. So the images at the top are cigar store Indians, another kind of racially stereotypical image from American pop culture, but they're facing artwork that was made by Native American Indian artists. At the bottom, you have an even more provoking image of chairs from the furniture collected from plantation houses, the big houses, seated and arranged as if to suggest that they are witnesses or spectators looking at a whipping post that would have been used for torture of slaves. So what you're seeing in a way is his attempt to kind of draw our attention to the disparity between the people who owned the objects and the people who did the work to generate the money to purchase those objects. That's very much part of what metalwork is there at the bottom. Slave shackles surrounded by the fine pewter and silver from within the home. They're really very difficult to look at without drawing the conclusions of how we can sanitize those objects. If we were to show just the beautiful furniture, it deletes the part of the story about how that furniture was obtained or how that was sustained. Definitely the Kienholzes, Ed and his wife Nancy, who worked together as assemblage sculptors. They created sculpture by combining objects, both things that they found in the environment, things that they made and fashioned together. His work, their work together, is very much about very politically, socially sensitive issues. The illegal operation obviously references back alley abortions at points when abortion had become illegal in various states. He also did pieces that reference or directly deal with issues of sexual violence, and you can certainly see that in the piece to the right that is very much about the use of the car as kind of an escape from parental observation, but the potential violence that could happen there as well is pretty remarkable. One of his, I should say, a lot of the Kienholz work initially was attributed just to Ed Kienholz, but he insisted that everything that he made after his marriage to Nancy should in fact be credited to both of them. So the Kienholz group together created this piece, which is clearly about lynch mobs and clearly about that kind of inherent violence. They're very disturbing images to see in person. They're installed sculptures, so you can actually walk around and see these objects from multiple points of view. Lynching has been a subject in sculpture in America actually for quite a long time. These pieces are from exhibitions in the 1930s that directly addressed the crimes that were happening at that point. The work at the left is by Japanese-American artist Isamu Noguchi, and at the right, Seymour Lipton, both of whom are addressing a subject that was happening, that they were aware of, that was happening during their own lifetimes. So the art of controversy, that's our next big topic here. Art that has made people question, art that has seemed shocking to people when it premiered. This is a great example of a piece that really irritated people. This piece is a public sculpture. It is originally was installed in front of a federal office building in New York City. Now, there is a program called Percent for Art in which a percentage of the overall budget for a federally funded building must be spent on public work. And usually that is an art piece, often a sculpture that is outdoors that people can see. It could be a mural, could be other forms. This particular building, when it was being built, the percent for art that was going to be spent for this piece amounted to 0.5% of the overall budget, $175,000, which is a lot of money, obviously, but it's not, you know, $1 billion. The way that the Percent for Art program works is that artists submit proposals and a committee of art professionals will judge and decide who's going to get the commission. And so the commission went to the artist that you see here on this slide. I suddenly can't say his name, Richard Serra. Richard Serra's work at the time was very much in the public eye. He was one of the leading sculptors in the art world. He had multiple magazine covers, solo exhibitions, and his work was part of minimalism and also part of a style that he referred to as process art. It was more about the making of the thing than about the final image. So he did things like leaning large sheets of steel precariously against walls to create tension. He created installations where you had to walk in between various curved walls of steel to re-experience or experience the space of the gallery in a different way. He was definitely getting a lot of press, a lot of attention, and Richard Serra won the commission for this piece. So he created an arc, slightly tilted a wall that was going to be put into this big plaza in front of the federal building. Now, it may seem really silly, it may seem simple, it may seem stupid, but the people who were on the committee decided this was a cutting-edge, important American artist. They wanted his work, what they chose. Weirdly, the people who worked in the office building, there was actually a survey done, and about exactly 50% of people who worked in the office building where the piece was located, 50% liked it, 50% hated it. It was a really love it, hate it kind of piece of it. It is very much meant to kind of push your buttons. If you look at it from the side, you can see it does look kind of dangerous, and that was part of what Serra was about, was really making you aware of the space you're in and making you feel a bit of danger, or a bit of need to move when you react to the work. When you see it from above, you can see how frustrating it was. It completely blocks the plaza, and it creates a curve that goes kind of counter to all of the other curves in the design and layout of the plaza itself. If you were to walk from the office building out to have your lunch at the fountain, you'd have to walk around it and counter the thing and move around it. That's kind of what Serra's work was about in a way. It was challenging your relationship to space. So it worked very much in of what his goals were. And he very specifically said that the piece was meant for that space, that if it was moved to, say, a large open field, it would no longer have the same function. And ironically, that's what people decided they wanted to do with it. There was enough of a public outcry, love it, hate it, that the government decided to remove the piece. And they did so on a weekend at night so that there would not be a protest from the people who supported the piece. Kind of an interesting case. When you see his work in a gallery situation, it might make more sense. I think you really are meant to experience it as a way of forcing you or controlling your movement through space and challenging your relationship to the space that you're in. My personal favorite is this one, because you really would have to move in, around, and through it, and the curves create these little events. Obviously, though, a sculpture like this in an open public space would be really problematic. People could hide there, there'd be health and safety issue, a personal safety issue. But you can see this piece is actually installed in a gallery. There's a wall around the outside. You have to go in, pay your admission ticket to go in. So only people who have come to the gallery would be able to see that particular piece. It's kind of interesting to think about artists' their right to self-expression, and we certainly have seen some works by Robert Mapplethorpe that push some buttons about public art and about the subjects that artists can talk about in their work. So Mapplethorpe's work was very much autobiographical. He made a lot of pieces about his own personal life. He made things that were both photographs of still life objects, very beautiful, but he also made photographs about his own sexuality and about his battle with HIV/AIDS. And so when Mapplethorpe died, there was a decision to have a retrospective, a show of all of his best work from his mature career. And that show actually traveled to a couple of different cities before it finally created enough of a kind of public scandal that it was temporarily shut down. So in fact, at one point when the show went to Cincinnati, the director of the gallery in Cincinnati was actually taken away in handcuffs. There was a court case about public decency because so many of the images had sexual content. So there was an attempt to shut the show down and to try the director on charges of pornography, essentially. So in the court case, no one on the jury was in any way connected to the art world. In fact, if you had even taken an art appreciation course, you would not be eligible to serve on the jury. They were completely non-educated in art at all, to make it fair, I suppose. And the people who were opposed to Mapplethorpe's work really thought that they would be able to win the case based on just public decency issues. The people who were supporting art about self-expression thought that they would maybe be able to win using the First Amendment as one of their arguments. So Amendment 1 to the Constitution does guarantee us the freedom of speech, freedom of expression. It's definitely part and parcel of that. Also, one of the things that they used in this argument was from the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act from 1965. This is essentially something that establishes the National Endowment for the Arts. Not that you need to read all of it, but remember that these are people that the American public voted to represent them. Those members of Congress are writing and enacting laws. They're establishing guidelines for what the government should do. So this is our leaders telling themselves how they should respond to culture and to art. And so my favorite one is this one, number 3. An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to other branches of scholarly and cultural activity. Also, from that same act of Congress, that the arts should foster mutual respect for diverse beliefs and values of all persons and groups. So it's also important to notice that the government tells itself that no government can create a great artist, but that it is necessary for the government to create and sustain a climate encouraging freedom of thought, imagination, and inquiry, as well as the material conditions facilitating the release of that creative talent. So this is part of what Mapplethorpe did. This image has really nothing to do with sexuality. It's not challenging in any way. And his work was divided into 2 portfolios. He chose to do that. The X portfolio was the more sexually themed work. The Y portfolio was the work that had nothing to do with sexuality and had to do with beauty, form, light, color, etc. So what the upshot of this was that really Mapplethorpe's work was to show both sides of his life, to show beauty and ugliness, to show happiness and pain, to show the full range of his human experience that was really at the heart of what he was doing. By no means am I going to show you any of the truly controversial ones, but you can see why some people were kind of provoked. There were images that were definitely leaning more into sexuality that were included in the exhibition as well. So the court case also involved trying to define or to use public law precedents for how we define pornography. And so obscenity is very much at the heart of the pornography debate. This is actually a court case that was cited in the case about Mapplethorpe's work, that really the red arrow there is pointing to the point that most people who were against Mapplethorpe's work thought would work for their argument, that the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work obscene or offensive. Well, certainly the contemporary standards change over time. If you about the kind of language that you hear in popular music today is much different from what it was even 20 years ago or 40 years ago. Your grandparents definitely didn't hear some of the words or themes or ideas that you hear on pop culture if you listen to the radio anymore, or contemporary MP3 downloads, however you're getting your music now. The themes have changed a lot. Our public acceptance of certain ideas has changed a lot. But the main point that was being missed really was the first point in this court case, that when we're looking at work and trying to decide where the line is at obscenity, we have to take the work and consider it as a whole and see whether it has serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And certainly Mapplethorpe's work had the artistic aspect down, but it also had a political, scientific value because so much of it was themed about what was happening around the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s into the early 90s. So ironically, even the people on the jury didn't like the work. They hated it, thought it was ugly, never wanted to see it again. They ended up having to side on the side of allowing the art to exist and to be shown. It did create, though, a public debate about how much public funding should go toward public art. And so now the National Endowment for the Arts actually funds far fewer exhibitions. It funds more things like bringing artists into schools to do projects with kids. But it was an interesting kind of flashpoint to think about the fact that even though people might not have personally loved the art, they felt that they couldn't argue against an artist's right to make work that expressed their vision and their experience of their own lives. That's a pretty recent example, relatively speaking, but I wanted to show you some other examples that really shocked people at the time they made. This is a painting that actually starts the Impressionist movement, and it's got a naked lady in it. It's very shocking. To us today, this may seem kind of tame. You don't really see much. And in fact, what was shocking to people was that there was a nude woman with two clothed men. But the artist who made this knew exactly what he was doing. He based his painting on some earlier examples. Here's a painting from the Renaissance that was considered perfectly acceptable because the women in it, although they're nude with two men in an outdoor setting, what they represent are the muses. They're inspiring these two guys to write a love song. They're a poet and a troubadour, a singer. They're literally like the Beatles. They're like Paul McCartney, John Lennon. They're writing a love song together, right? They're like a songwriting team. And so the women are visible to us as the art viewers, but they're invisible to the guys who are working on the song. They are their muses, the goddesses appearing to inspire them. Obviously, because the woman in the painting by Manet is not a goddess from the ancient past, that makes her nudity far more shocking. But look at this. That red rectangle there shows you the poses of three figures that are exactly the same as the pose Manet has used in his Luncheon on the Grass painting. The image that you're seeing is a print made after a painting by none other than Raphael. And ironically, the people in that painting, for the most part, are male, nude male forms. It's kind of odd to think that Manet knew his art history well enough to know that by showing this painting, people would probably recognize the subject in terms of the composition. They might recognize the reference to the goddesses in the painting that we saw by Titian. He's definitely pushing buttons by showing these people in contemporary French clothing. That makes it really force the audience to think about what they're looking at when they're looking at a nude. If it's a nude, but we're saying it's okay because it's a goddess, does that put her clothes back on? It certainly doesn't, right? So he's kind of calling out our hypocrisy by showing us contemporary people. This is a painting that you wouldn't think would have caused a controversy. It's a painting of fireworks reflected over water. It's by Abbott McNeill Whistler, the artist who painted Whistler's mother. He actually got into a court case over this painting because a critic who could make or break his career wrote a scathing review of this painting. It was absolutely insulting. So Whistler sued him for libel, which is basically slander in written form. Libel would be intentionally trying to destroy someone's career through writing. This is what Ruskin, the critic, said. He used, of course, the terminology of late 1800s, so it may be kind of hard for us to translate. What he wrote was that he was shocked by the ill-educated conceit of the artist, that it approached the aspect of willful imposture, that I've seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but I never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space. If we translate that, what he's actually saying, and kind of put 21st century terms, he's calling the artist poorly educated, not really talented and not educated in art, that he is getting out of his lane, that he's not staying in his place, that he shouldn't be trying to make art. He calls him Cockney, and that is kind of code for saying that he's low class. So now he's not just poor educated, now he's not worthy, that he's being impudent. Again, he's getting out of his class, out of his station, out of his lane. He calls him a coxcomb. If you think about the little flappy red thing on the top of rooster's head, that's the coxcomb. And of course, roosters move their heads the way birds do very quickly. That would make the cocks flop around. It's an implication of him being a fool, like wearing a hat with bells on it, but it also kind of is emasculating him as well. 200 guineas is an amount of money, so he's saying that he's asking too much money for the purchase or the sale of this painting, and he's done nothing but fling paint in your face. Ironically, the judge in the case asked Whistler how long it took him to paint the painting, as if the amount of time would mean that it was better if it took longer. Whistler got around that in a really clever way. He actually said to the judge that it took him his whole life to learn to paint this way. So he ends up winning the court case, which is pretty funny. The amount of money that we're talking about, by the way, 200 guineas in 2001 was worth roughly 14.5 grand. So not even really the price of a new, really nice new car. Certainly not enough to feed even one person for an entire year. So if he only sold 3 or 4 paintings a year, he wasn't asking for $1 million. He was asking for a pretty reasonable amount. Plenty of artists from the early 20th century were showcased in an art exhibition in America called the Armory Show, and it was kind of a scandalous exhibition because it showcased these very modern thinking European artists like Matisse, Brancusi, and Kandinsky. We also included work in that exhibition by Vincent van Gogh, and some American artists as well. In fact, 300 artists overall, 100 Europeans, 200 Americans, all very modern styles, but this painting was shown there and it created kind of a sensation. It is known as Nude Descending a Staircase, #2, and a lot of people didn't see a nude body in it. In fact, it was described by one person in a newspaper article as being an explosion in a shingle factory. But if you really look carefully at the front here, you can see what looks kind of like a face. There's an eyebrow ridge, a nose, definitely a head. The torso here is divided, so you see the breast. You can really see an arm to an elbow, to a wrist, certainly hips, clearly a thigh, and then really if you look here, this is truly the giveaway. You can see the swing of the leg, the shin and calf, as the figure descends the stairs. You can see she's painted on top of herself over and over and over again in kind of abstracted geometric forms. So sometimes just our initial gut reaction to something is to dislike it, and if we don't take the time to investigate, we may not understand what we're seeing. There's definitely a movement of artists using art as activism, and one of the best examples I can give you is the Guerrilla Girls. They're a group of artists, female artists, obviously. They spell their name guerrilla, like guerrilla warfare, but they dress literally in gorilla masks, kind of as a joke. But they use advertising and posters, stickers, etc., flyers, ways of using print media to kind of showcase hypocrisy in the art world. This is one of my favorite of their pieces, The Advantages of Being a Woman. It's obviously ironic, obviously tongue-in-cheek. One of the advantages would be working without the pressure of success. They're being very bitterly ironic in the statement that they're making. Here you see them dressed as gorillas, and this is perhaps one of their best known campaigns. These were on the sides of buses in New York City. They literally did statistical analysis of what was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the largest American art museum. Less than 3% of the artists in the modern section are women, but 83% of the nudes are female bodies. That really does kind of make you think about who art is for, who makes it, controls it, and that's very much what they're using their art to do, is to make political statement.